So I'm delighted we've got Ben Jones here from the Oxford University Arboretum to speak to us. I've been talking to Ben and his colleagues for some time about their projects involving Japan, which particularly involve what's it called, the municipal gardens in Toyama City. So I visited the Arboretum and seen some of the rare species, and there's a particular area there which is based on the mountain by Toyama City, right? So some of the rare species from Japan are being grown in that particular area. So we've managed to get Ben to come along and talk to us here about it. He's the Arboretum Curator at the Arboretum in Oxford University. And it says here he's passionate about plant conservation with a particular focus on trees. So that's just as well. Yeah. Well, really, that's probably all I need to say to introduce you, Ben. So I'll pass straight over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. And I'd just like to start by saying thank you for inviting me to talk this evening. I've been looking forward to this for some time. And it's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about the work that we're doing in Japan, and sort of the work we're doing between sort of Oxford and Toyama and other locations. I might just grab some water. Yeah. Before I get into the talk itself, I think it's worth noting that a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about this evening actually started by a Japanese PhD student, Nodaka Nakamura, who was a student in Oxford. She was studying her DPhil, and maybe had she been studying the flora of Chile, then I might, although we're not here, be talking about the flora of Chile. But her research sort of focused on the flora of Japan and looking at sort of what we call bioquality hotspots, which I'll talk about this evening. And that really became the premise to what has been almost 15 years of work now. And the Botanic Garden and Arboretum decided that we needed to sort of try and bridge that gap between the science and the horticulture, and we decided to sort of focus on Japan because we could not only do the botanical surveys but collect plant material and then grow that at the Botanic Garden and Arboretum. So this evening I'm going to kind of take you on that sort of journey and look at the background to the work and some of the research that's going on, and then the botanical surveys, the seed collecting, and how that all kind of integrates sort of into our work in Oxford, but also some of the other projects that have come off that relating to cherry trees. So we'll jump straight in. And Japan has an incredible flora that starts perhaps up in Hokkaido, and the alpine zone of the flora sort of about 1,500 meters or above in Hokkaido, but then in central Japan, in Honshu, you'll find that sort of 2,500 meters above, and sort of defined with quite a harsh sort of climate, sort of snow cover for quite a period of the year. And then in terms of the vegetation, we're looking at sort of dwarf shrubs and tundra communities. So you're looking at sort of pines, rhododendrons, and other plants. And then as we sort of start coming down into the cool temperate or the boreal zone, and that's typically found in northern Honshu and certain areas of Hokkaido. Cold winters, heavy snowfall, and sort of short sort of growing season. And then you start to find, in terms of the vegetation, sort of mixed forests of beech and fir and spruce. And spruces in particular are a pioneer species similar to birch. And then some of the other characteristic sort of species that you will find in these regions, we've got birches, spruce, larch, and dwarf pines again. And then coming further down into the temperate zone, we have across the sort of central regions of Honshu, where you start getting very distinct seasons, and we then start getting into the deciduous broadleaf forests of beech and oak, maples, birch and magnolia. And then we also start coming across conifers such as firs, hemlocks, and the Japanese umbrella pine. In fact, this photo was taken on Mount Musashi in Niigata Prefecture, and actually the photo was actually taken on the very sort of spot with the sort of the northernmost range of the Japanese umbrella pine in Niigata, or Scydoptis verticillata. And then coming further down into the warm temperate zone, and that's typically across southern Kyushu, Shikoku, southern parts of southern Honshu. We start getting, the mild winters, warm summers, abundant rainfall, and these sort of forests are the sort of evergreen oaks and laurel forests, and then oaks and so forth. But then we get these sort of transition species as well, such as the camellias, orchudas, and Japanese cedars, although the latter being sort of planted fairly extensively. And then coming further south again into the subtropical zones, sort of Okinawa, the island of Amami and so forth, hot, humid, mild winters, influenced by the Kuroshio current. And the vegetation here, we've got these sort of evergreen broadleaf forests, and then sort of tree ferns and cycads and mangroves. And I thought, sort of with all of that in mind, it'd be useful just to sort of put Japan into sort of a regional context. And in East Asia, incredibly high floristic diversity. We have 31 endemic families, which in fact no other part of the world has such a high number, and 600 endemic genera. And Japan specifically, we've got over 7,500 species, we've got 315 families, and we've got actually sort of 25% of the flora that only occurs in Japan that is in fact endemic. However, one of the sort of challenges is the fact that 25% of the flora in Japan is threatened with extinction. And to sort of add to this, if we look at Japan's forests, that 2/3 of the national land are covered by forests, but 10 million hectares of that, is a single species sort of plantation, be it Japanese cedar, larch, or cypress. And at the moment now, these plantations in many cases are sort of fully ready for harvesting. And so this brings us to a more regional sort of focus, and Japan in fact is one of 36 global biodiversity hotspots, and this map sort of shows their global distribution. And a biodiversity hotspot is defined by having 1,500 or more endemic species, of which Japan has almost 2,000. But notably, that only 30% or less of its natural vegetation remaining. And when this sort of concept was first published in 2000, at the time, there were only 10 global biodiversity hotspots around the world. And so the fact that these days there are now 36 kind of demonstrates the pressure on biodiversity globally. But one of the challenges with this concept is the fact that it's sort of global, it's not local, and sort of focusing on number of species, we have to recognise that not all areas are equal. And so the question is, how do you prioritise within this hotspot? We know that Japan is a global biodiversity hotspot, but we also know that large parts of it are not. And so the question is, how do we sort of find hotspots within hotspots? And so this is where the research sort of comes in. And we've been operating within what's called the bioquality concept, and it was Nodaka who produced the first bioquality hotspot map. And as you can see here, it expresses the concentration of globally rare species, but locally. And it does this by focusing on quality, not quantity, and it's looking at the distribution of a species. And so all plant species, in the case of Japan, have been put into their star categories, where we have black star as the most rare, and then green star as the most common. So the green star species will be globally common, going across Asia, maybe into Europe. And those stars are weighted, but they are weighted in an inverse proportion to the species distribution. So your globally rare are weighted 27, and your globally common are weighted 0. And by doing so, we can calculate the genetic heat index, and the GHI, you can sort of liken that to sort of centigrade and temperature. And so when you take a checklist, when you take a flora species into their star categories, we can then calculate at multiple scales the genetic heat index of these different areas. And it was Nodoka, in fact, who produced the first sort of work on this for Japan. And so building on Nodoka's work, and this is where my research has sort of focused, I've built a database of the Japanese flora, which now contains over 9 million records. And these data have been sort of compiled from a range of different sources, from online herbaria, Nodoka's work, local floras and checklists, but also ground truthing this work and kind of getting out into Japan, working with local partners, and conducting botanical surveys to sort of see whether our results and so forth, are true or accurate. And within this, we have to ask ourselves the question, what constitutes a good record? And a good record is an accepted scientific name, and for that record to be geo-referenced. And with the two, that enables us to produce the hotspot maps. And we can see here the sort of taxonomic breakdown in terms of number of species and so forth, but also the number of taxa that have been assigned stars. And so what we can see here, there are 710 species within the flora of Japan that are not only endemic to the country, but in many cases not only occur just in one prefecture, but only on one or two mountains, and that is it. And then at the bottom, you can see GX, and actually those are species that have been introduced to Japan. And just to give you an example of some of those plants, on the right-hand side here, we have a species of birch, Betula platyphylla, and that's a green star species, so it's globally common. And we're not saying that these aren't important. In fact, often, they're very important from an ecological perspective in terms of their role, within a forest or a landscape unit. But over on the far left, we have Betula chichibuensis, which I will talk about a bit more this evening. But this species of birch is not only endemic to Japan, but only occurs in Saitama Prefecture and on 2 mountains, and that is it. And what we can see here, just very briefly, using the database and the analysis from that, we can produce these sort of maps. So we have at the top here the floristic groups at 1 degree resolution, 0.125, but also the genetic heat index scores. And what we're starting to see is hotspots appearing within hotspots, where as we increase the resolution, as we build the database with a lot more data, what we can see here, are these hotspots. And you would assume that down in the Ryukyus and sort of southern Japan, where we know that this is a hotspot from a floristic perspective. As you go up the degrees of latitude and you increase the resolution, what we're finding are these sort of hotspots, much further up the country. And just to kind of give you, I suppose, some more recent results from this, having sort of modelled these data and produced these distribution maps, what we've been doing in more recent times is ground truthing these results. And so focusing on Picea koyami, which occurs in the Yatsugatake mountain ranges in Nagano Prefecture. This is a black star species. It's critically endangered. And by producing these maps back in the UK and then going to Japan, working with our colleagues in Japan and conducting the botanical surveys, we've been able to locate these populations. And what I should also add is that the GHI value is globally comparable. And so, although the floristic composition on a mountaintop in Liberia is going to be different, a GHI score of 200 or more is actually globally significant. And so one of the roles of these results is to sort of enable people to understand the significance of the plants and the flora that they're working with. And this is just some photographs of the Picea koyami in Nagano Prefecture, and I'm pleased to say that we've got work ongoing with this, focusing on sort of in situ conservation programs. So that was a sort of whistle-stop tour of the sort of the research and the sort of scientific work that underpins the rest of what I'm going to sort of talk to you about this evening. And the work in Japan started in 2012, and our first visit actually focused just on meeting and greeting, just building relationships and understanding what our partners would like to work on, as well as the work that we would like to do. And over those years, that's enabled us to sort of strengthen working relationships between Japan and the UK and between partners in Oxford. We've made over 400 different seed collections of different species, which has generated lots of herbarium vouchers, lots of data capture, and then the database will be published online. And then we have over 25,000 images, which will underpin a lot of our collections, and then seed banking and benefit sharing, as well as building relationships with different botanic gardens. In fact, we've signed 2 memorandums of understanding, which I'll talk about this evening. And then excitingly for us was the opportunity to work with our partners in Toyama in particular to reintroduce 17 different species or cultivars of cherries to Japan, as well as seed exchanges and lectures. And this evening I want to focus actually on our relationship with Toyama Botanic Garden. And this is a garden that we've worked with since 2012. And this photo was taken, I think it was 2017 or 2018, when we signed the MOU with them. And we have Professor Simon Hiscock, and the director of the Botanic Garden and Arboretum, and then Nakata-san and then the team from Toyama. And I'm really pleased to say that not only was that 5-year MOU signed, but that's now been extended for a further 5 years. And it was great to see that relationship sort of picking up coverage in the media. And as part of this MOU, we had a seed exchange. And the team in Toyama very kindly gave us seed from the Japanese cedar, Cryptomeria japonica. This was one of the first populations where they recorded sort of male sterile Cryptomeria, so it's not producing pollen. And those trees are growing very well now in Oxford. And as part of that seed exchange, we gifted Toyama seed from our famous black pine that was at the Botanic Garden. And that specimen actually was the first introduction to the UK. But it was also Tolkien's favourite tree in the garden. And he was often seen sort of in the garden, and the tree itself kind of gave inspiration for Treebeard and other parts of his writings, which was great. So it was wonderful to be able to give that seed to Toyama. There are specimens planted at the Botanic Garden, but this one in the middle here is actually planted outside the Literary Museum in the city. So it's great to be able to share that with them. And at the Botanic Gardens in Toyama, they've created the Oxford border, which goes from strength to strength each time. I'm very lucky enough to see that. And as Jason mentioned at the beginning, in Oxford we have been developing what we refer to as our Mount Tateyama collection. And there are almost 80 different plants in this collection now, and every single one of them has grown from seed that we've collected off that mountain with staff from Toyama. And the Arboretum, the vision has to be, 200 or 300 years. It's great that we've got these wonderful big trees to enjoy now, but actually we need to be thinking multiple generations in advance, and this is very much a long-term commitment. At the moment, it's woody plants, but as those trees and shrubs establish and shaded areas are created, then we'll get the herbaceous layer in and so forth. But short of taking everybody to Toyama and to that mountain, which would be great, our hope is that you can come to the Arboretum and get a feel for some of the beautiful, wonderful plants that are on that mountain. In this picture here, I should note, actually top left, this is a hazel leaf birch, Betula coralifolia, and then bottom right and in the middle is the Katsura tree, Cicidophyllum japonicum, which gives off that wonderful candy floss, sort of burnt sugar aroma in the autumn. But one of the great things about collaborating, especially with our partners in Japan, obviously is the work. but it's also the social. It's also about building those personal relationships, and it's been really wonderful to be able to spend time, you know, both inside and outside of work with the team in Toyama, and you know, who are incredibly passionate about their plants. And this is something that is so important when it comes to doing the field work, that actually that it's collaborative, that it's as much to do with what they're researching, working on, as much as it is ourselves. And I'm always in complete awe of their plant knowledge, of their local flora. And so going back to the bioquality concept and the database and those maps, that's the sort of the desk-based side of it, but the sort of the enjoyable part, even more so actually, is the botanical surveys, which underpins that research and the ground truthing. And so we use a method called rapid botanic survey, and although it kind of makes you think that we run around really fast looking at as many plants as possible, it's much to do with how quickly we can process the data and these herbarium vouchers, but it's a very efficient sort of biodiversity assessment. And we can do, you know, sometimes 3 or 4 surveys in a day. It's very systematic, and it's very much a team approach that, you know, working with local partners as well. You know, we're producing a lot of herbarium vouchers, sort of dried specimens for verification at later points. But then applying the bioquality concept and putting those species into their star rating actually illuminates that survey site in terms of its significance by being able to calculate the GHI value. And then this work can also contribute to conservation and impact assessments. And as I mentioned earlier, it's scalability, that actually this is something that can be done, you know, on a small patch of land all the way up to a sort of a country level sort of scale in some cases. And these surveys give a wonderful opportunity to kind of really learn plants and sort of get hands-on. But it also brings you face to face with some of the other components of field work, and that has certainly been an interesting experience, shall we say. This is a tiger keelback snake, top left, but actually I'm not so worried about spiders, but it's the hornet. When I hear that hornet sort of coming through, that tends to make me a bit more nervous. But as I was mentioning, you know, these are some of the team from Toyama, and as I said, working together, especially when it comes to botanical surveys, you know, it's a real privilege actually to be able to access some of these special sites in Toyama, and not only do we get the opportunity to work with staff, but the friends of their botanic garden, often on a Saturday or Sunday, they will go and botanise, and you know, it's great to be able to join them. And again, it's just, you know, so impressed with their sort of local knowledge of their flora. And you know, the nice thing about building these relationships and experiencing these lovely plant communities with the friends of the garden is that they also share with you their favourite restaurants and their favourite places to eat. And I probably enjoy the food as much as the plants. I probably shouldn't say, probably slightly more. But coming back to Toyama and conducting these botanical surveys, Toyama actually holds the 3rd oldest population of the Japanese cedar, the oldest being down in Nakashima, the 2nd in Niigata Prefecture, and here the 3rd oldest population which is in Toyama. And it's wonderful to be able to kind of, you know, sort of work in these areas, in and amongst just some magnificent trees. And working in these forests actually, especially in the more sort of temperate regions, certainly compared to the UK, there's almost a familiarity with these forests, but also recognising they're also quite different. And so you will see ash and oak and beech, and in this case horse chestnut. This is the Japanese horse chestnut, Aesculus turbinata. And you'll also find, you know, maybe plants that you're familiar with. You know, in gardens generally we have magnolias, deutzias, hostas, and so forth. The Diphyllea in the bottom left there is a very interesting plant actually, because when it flowers the petals are translucent. It's quite a remarkable plant. But as I mentioned, sometimes you do find things that are sort of quite widespread in horticulture, but you also get to experience perhaps the more unique or the rare plants. And in this case here we have Helwingia japonica, and this is a fascinating plant because it flowers and fruits on the midrib of the leaf, and it's pollinated by insects, by flies typically, and it's a very sort of, from an evolutionary perspective, is sort of a very early plant, and part of the reason for this strategy is that in those sort of kind of dark, sort of shadowy, sort of layers of vegetation, by having the flower in the middle of the leaf on that midrib, just helps the insects sort of locate that flower. And then we also have parasitic plants. So this is Lithrea japonica, and typically this will parasitize on hazel, birch, oak, alder and elm, and because it doesn't have any chlorophyll, it takes everything that it needs from those plants that it's parasitizing. And so with these botanical surveys, the sort of sample site, if you like, is, rather than it being like a measured quadrat or 100 metres by 100 metres and so forth, what we're looking for is a homogeneous landscape unit, and the boundary of that sample point could be defined by a track or a stream or a distinct change in topography, and the idea is to record and capture every vascular plant species that occur within that survey site. And so often when we get back to where we're working from, this is a fairly typical scene where we're processing these vouchers, and in many cases, and again this comes down to the importance of collaborating and working with partners, being able to get a name to each of these specimens, but that isn't always possible, and that's why kind of having these dried specimens and then using herbaria to enable us to put a name to them, is so important. And often we're working, away from the city in different locations, and from my perspective, it's wonderful to have the opportunity to sort of stay in local Ryokan and sort of, experience and enjoy, these aspects of the work in Japan, which really is a privilege. And it is great to be able to stay in locations like this, but I do feel a little bit bad when the rooms sometimes look like this. And from my perspective, it's wonderful to be able to spend, often actually long nights sort of trying to work out, which plant is which, and kind of, keying these things out. And it reminds me actually the first time that I visited Japan, and we had just finished a very long day surveying, and to my shame, I must admit, I was fairly ill prepared in terms of things generally, I think. And we were driving back, and we had a long journey back, and my colleagues just said to me and my colleague from Oxford, "Oh, we're just going to go for onsen." And in that moment, I didn't know what really that meant. I kind of vaguely, I thought, okay, I think that is maybe a bath of some description. And then they explained, I said, I don't have anything with me, and they're like, no, you're fine, it's fine. And then very shortly we sort of ended up in this onsen, and we all sat there enjoying the hot spring, and we've not looked back since. It was quite an experience, sort of sat there, sort of in this outdoor onsen actually, which is very enjoyable to say the least, and sort of sitting with colleagues and sort of, perhaps in a very British way, kind of just talking about the plants that we could see from the hot bath. But anyway. So we've got the botanical surveys, and a lot of that is informed by the database and research and so forth. But what we then try and do is to build on that, and this is in Toyama. This is part of the Mount Tateyama range, and one of many sort of sites, and building on those botanical surveys, which creates very accurate but very useful sort of baseline data. We then conduct our seed collecting. We will have target species for a number of reasons. These might be species that are important from a conservation perspective. They may be a priority for our Japanese partners. There's lots of different factors that influence what we're focusing on. But the method is what's important. And so there's a lot of data capture. And at the moment, or certainly historically, we've used just a paper format. And we're collecting a range of data from who's on the team that day, location data, habitat information, population and sampling data, as well as the seed quality, and then herbarium vouchers and where they're going off. And recently, actually, trying to sort of streamline this, I've actually built an app that I'm going to be trialling this autumn, where we can capture this data sort of in real time, that colleagues in Oxford can see in real time, and it will hopefully label images and all sorts, but we'll have paper backup, as I'm sure that this technology isn't always as reliable as it ought to be. But in addition to that sort of data capture, and yes, we've got herbarium vouchers, but building those digital assets and photographing all of the plants that we collect, not only enables us to maybe correct a name if we've made a mistake, but it also means that when we're doing our work at our respective gardens, that the sort of the teaching, the engagement, the public engagement and so forth, all of these digital assets can be used hopefully to inspire people and sort of future generations. And so having collected all of this seed is really important for a number of reasons, that we clean the seed. And the best sort of example I can give, if you imagine going to Sainsbury's and buying a kilo of raspberries, you've got to get all the pips out and all the flesh gone. What we don't want to be doing is sort of introducing any sort of pests and diseases, either spreading them within Japan or bringing them back to the UK. So it's really important part of that process that all of this seed is cleaned. But again, it's a really great way to learn plants at almost an intimate level, but also sort of build this sort of digital asset. And because we take this very seriously, when our consignments come back to the UK, we will then send it down to forest researcher Alice Holt, who will x-ray the seed. And this informs many things really. In certain cases, it's actually sort of identified seed that has sort of got eggs or larvae in, which they can then safely dispatch of, but it can also start to inform us about viability rates. And if we're trying to develop germination protocols, especially for those range restricted or globally rare species, this is something that is really important. And then in addition to the seed collecting and the vouchers, and the photographs, is the herbarium vouchers. And years ago when I started this work, actually this was quite a laborious process of probably every day or every other day changing wet newspaper with the cuttings inside, and it would take a long time in certain cases to dry these herbarium vouchers. But I will be eternally grateful again to my colleagues in Japan who taught me the art of using a futon dryer to dry these specimens. And you can see here at the bottom that rather than, as you would traditionally do, sort of really cinch that press down and try and take the moisture out of the plants, actually what you do is you sort of layer it up with the newspaper and the foam inserts, and you kind of create this sort of wind tunnel essentially through the herbarium press. So there's been many a hotel in Japan where in the bathroom or in the hotel room it's been turned into a small herbarium with futon dryers drying plant material, but it's incredibly satisfying because actually by the time I wake up in the morning, 90%, if not more sometimes, are dry, which is great. Conifers, so we've got two species of fir here. We have Aedes laurisii and Aedes homolepsis, and these pose quite a challenge when it comes to creating good vouchers because of the cones, and also typically, even if you do manage to get them dry, all the needles fall off, and then it's not really much use. And again, our colleagues in Toyama sort of enlightened us to a method whereby these voucher specimens are kind of soaked for 48, 72 hours in an alcohol solution, and then when you take them out, actually, and then dry, the needles are retained, and it's very satisfying to be able to look at these voucher specimens years later and still see that detail. And in Oxford, we now have a large collection of herbarium vouchers of these wonderful plants that are all underpinned by the Botanical Survey data, images, and so forth. And this is a really valuable resource because it will tell you where a species was, both in terms of sort of spatial and temporal, and contributes, to a lot of the conservation assessments and the other research that we carry out. We also, just to introduce you to a number of plants that have now grown from those collections, and these photos are either of plants in the Arboretum or where they were collected in situ. And so top left, we have Clefla barbernervis that looks very similar actually to a deciduous rhododendron or deciduous azalea. Wonderful autumn colour, the bark on it, sort of exfoliates in sort of lovely sort of patterns. So, a real favourite of mine because not only do you get, this lovely spring, fresh green growth, you get the autumn colour, but then because it's deciduous, you get this wonderful kind of winter structure with the wonderful stems. We then have, on the top here, we're going to go from the top left to bottom right, we've got the next two, the Japanese hazel, Corylus boliana, with this sort of wonderful arrangement of the nuts there, and then we get this lovely sort of purple sort of colouring on the leaf, and it really is a very attractive plant. We then have the monarch birch, Betula maximoitsiana. There are 11 species of birch that occur across Japan. There are 59 globally around the northern hemisphere, and this birch is the largest leafed of all the birches, and certainly in the UK this is a very important plant in terms of creating resilient landscapes in the face of climate change. We then have Hervinia dulcis, top right there, with this very sort of curious looking sort of fruit, and then in the middle row, left to right, we've got Codonopsis, Ampelopsis, and then in the middle we have a species of alder, and then we have a viburnum here. And then this plant here on the right, this is used to be sapien, it's now Neochiracea japonica. And the reason I'm not using common names actually is often there aren't any. But this is going to be a really important plant. It's in the Euphorbia family, Euphorbiaceae, and something that we planted a fair amount of the Arboretum, and the autumn colour on this is absolutely spectacular. It's been planted on Acer Glade, and I think it's probably beginning to make some of the maples feel a bit uncomfortable with the show that they're putting on. And then bottom left we have actually two species of styrax, so Styrax herbacea and then Styrax japonica. The Styrax japonica is quite late flowering and is often planted as a street tree, and in fact that the next time you roll into Oyama and you come out of the train station and you go across the road, on your right hand side that whole street is lined with these Styrax, beautiful tree. We then have Eustaphis, bottom here with the red flower, and then we have Stuartia monodelpha, or the tall Stuartia in the tea family, and then we have another viburnum. And so this sort of combination of sort of science and conservation and horticulture, is really key, and bringing it back to threatened plant species. We can find the world's various plants, we can do the science and the research, but actually growing them, arguably, is almost more important, because you can find the various things, but if you can't grow them, then we're going to really struggle. And so, several years ago now, working with the University of Tokyo, we had an opportunity to go and work on a species of birch. And at the time, this was in 2014, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature published the Red List assessment, which is a conservation assessment of the birch family. And this particular species of birch was not only listed as critically endangered, but in fact that there were only 21 individuals left in the world. That was it. And so, working with our partners, we were able to locate this population and conduct botanical surveys, photograph, but also collect seed of this critically endangered plant species. And I'm pleased to say subsequent work has actually identified further two populations, but part of the reason this is so fragile is it occurs, it's very closely related to sort of limestone outcrops, and it has a very limited range anyway, and then in combination either with limestone being quarried or with sort of typhoons and sort of severe weather events, that has put it under great pressure. But I'm pleased to say that in 2014 and 2016 we were able to work on this species and to collect seed material and develop germination protocols for it. We were then able to share with our colleagues in Japan. At one point, there were more individuals growing in the Arboretum in Oxford than were known to be in the wild. But it was great to have the opportunity to collaborate with our partners in Japan on this and to bring this species back from the point of or the brink of extinction, and sort of share that with people. And it's great that the plants actually kind of can create such headlines. And I have to be honest, I wasn't expecting one evening, genuinely, as I was cooking my tea, to get a phone call from the New York Times about a birch tree. But it was wonderful that that it was getting that level of coverage, and on the BBC and various other sort of news outlets. And this sort of got me thinking that globally 2 in 5 plant species are threatened with extinction. And if we go into London, if we go into any city, school and so forth, and ask people, can you name me an animal threatened with extinction? Typically, you get a good response. But if we flip that question and say, well, just name me one plant, just one plant, often the response is nowhere near as good. And so, thinking about the Arboretum and how to sort of approach this challenge, I listed 20 trees. I could have done more. And then I looked up their conservation assessment based on the IUCN rating, and then I aligned them with their animal counterpart. So, for example, the giant redwood is as endangered as the blue whale, and somehow by pairing a plant and an animal just sort of lifts it a bit in such a way, hopefully, that people will understand the significance. And so this is how this trail got developed, and so this Chichibu birch sits very much within that. So, coming to an end now, I want to focus on going back to Toyama, the sort of horticulture sort of side of things. And as we know, Japan has an incredibly rich horticultural history and heritage. And as I mentioned, we can find these rare plants, but growing them is another thing. And across Japan, and coming back to Toyama and working with them, we have, the sort of the significance of plants, but more specifically, with cherry trees. And I'd read about cherry trees that blossom in the spring, but until recent years I've never experienced it myself. And being in Japan for the first time in the spring a couple of years back, really was the most incredible experience. As well as, and I hope NHK don't mind me using this graphic, but their wonderful cherry blossom forecast. And these wonderful trees, really capture, the hearts and minds of so many across Japan and further afield. And at Toyama, this is their sort of avenue of Yoshino cherry, which is a very widely, commonly sort of planted cherry tree. But these really are kind of sort of like living metaphors for beauty, and sort of remind us of that sort of cyclical rhythm of nature, and sort of they speak to us on so many levels. And I had the privilege of being in Toyama for their nighttime hanamai, and if you ever get the opportunity, it really is the most remarkable experience, and seeing these cherry trees in the daytime is one thing, but somehow, that nighttime experience really was very special. And so finally it kind of brings me to the last part of my talk, which is with Toyama Botanic Garden, and coming back to Ohara-san here, and the team, and as part of our memorandum of understanding with them, they requested our assistance with 17 cultivars of cherry. And the request actually was for these to be sent back to Japan. And there were 5 cultivars, in fact, that were historically, significant, these sort of heritage cultivars that over the years, over time, had become extinct in Japan. And Collingwood Ingram or Cherry Ingram had been working on these and had very much hoped to have returned them to Japan in his lifetime, but was unable to. And in addition to those were these new introductions, cultivars that the team in Toyama thought would be really wonderful to have in Japan. And it was a tremendous privilege to have the opportunity to be part of that team, the team in Japan as well as the UK, to locate this material. And then in February 2019, I'm very pleased to say that all of this signwood material was sent back to Toyama, and in fact, is thriving and surviving very well indeed. And it's wonderful to see either those cultivars that were extinct back in Japan and thriving and forming part of that treescape, or the excitement of having new cultivars as well. It was great, obviously, that it also kind of garnered quite a bit of interest with NHK and the local media, but it also introduced me, I'm very pleased to say, to a number of different people, including on the left here, Asari Sensei, who developed, he was a teacher in Hokkaido, but developed all of the Matsumai cherries, and is featured actually in Naoko Abe's new book, and then also being introduced to Naoko as well. And whilst it is important to obviously find the rare and endangered plants, I think the horticulture and the culturally significant cherry trees have given rise to this new exciting project that we're working on with the team from Toyama and Naoko and various other people. And I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you this evening about, very briefly, our new Blossoms Across Borders project, which has been made a reality actually thanks to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. And from Toyama's perspective, there is a second phase of cultivars that we would like to verify in the UK and repatriate to Japan. And from our perspective, we would like to document and collect the 11 wild species of cherry that occur across the country and bring those into the UK for people to enjoy across the UK, hopefully. So finally, I think, the vision for this work is very much about strengthening relationship through plants, through science, horticulture, heritage and culture. And I would like to thank the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation for their support, as well as the support from many others, the Sasakawa Foundation, as well as the team in Japan and Oxford and so forth. And thank you for your time and allowing me to speak this evening.